Hello and welcome to the Australian and New Zealand Environmental History Network for 2020. I'm Dr. Margaret Cook and I'm from the University of the Sunshine Coast. I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Yagara people in Ipswich, Queensland, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, as well as those from the lands where you are joining us from. Our first speaker today is Dr. Alda Bathrop-Lewis. And I'd like to welcome Alda to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, and to all the organizers for this great event. It's been a real pleasure to be with you these past few days. I'm joining you from Wurundjeri country in Melbourne and want to acknowledge Wurundjeri elders past, present, and emerging and their ongoing relationships with the land and waters where I live. So over the last 3 days, I've been really grateful for the in-depth historical work that has been on display at this conference, describing the stories of places, creatures, activists, families, and politicians who have co-constituted and responded to Australian wetlands, reefs, disasters, and theories of Aboriginal land management. But I do not work on Australian environmental history myself. My own disciplinary training wasn't even in the discipline of history, but in religious studies in the United States, where my research focused on the philosophical study of religious and ethical ideas in the political context where they are worked out. So this paper I'm going to give you has a title, More Than Human History of Thoreau's Walden Woods, because my interest as a reader of environmental history comes out of the fact that as a scholar of religion, I've spent most of my relatively new career studying the famous US author Henry David Thoreau, who you might call an early environmental historian. I have a book coming out in December titled Thoreau's Religion, Walden Woods, Social Justice and the Politics of Asceticism. In these 10 minutes, I'm going to try to explain how some of the work I've done for that book about Thoreau's religion may be interesting to the community of scholars that's gathered here. So I want to begin with the recent article by Emily O'Gorman and Andrea Gaynor in the journal Environmental History called More Than Human Histories. There, O'Gorman and Gaynor describe how approaches developed in environmental humanities, especially approaches often described as multi-species or more than human, can enrich work ongoing in environmental history. O'Gorman and Gaynor are responding to the way in which much early environmental history, as it developed in the 1960s and 70s, was premised on an understanding of nature as distinct from culture, while scholarly movements to understand nature instead, as a culturally constructed concept, emerged in environmental history in the 1990s. O'Gorman and Gaynor describe environmental history as a field that nonetheless still often conceives of nature and humanity as distinct from one another, and in nature in some sense as an object. This linguistic intractability, as they call it, persists even in the discourse of those of us trying to undermine nature-culture binaries. Because of environmental history's continued work toward a more thorough interrogation of the nature-culture divide, O'Gorman and Gaynor suggest that the field can benefit from taking up insights from what they call relational approaches in environmental humanities, developed through the work of scholars in the 1980s and 90s like Donna Haraway, Karen Barad, Val Plumwood, and Bruno Latour, and in the 21st century like Sarah Wetmore, Jane Bennett, Tom Van Doren, and Anna Singh. Such scholars have worked to describe alternative ontologies and epistemologies, which is to say, views of what is and how we know it, that are premised on human embeddedness in relational networks. O'Gorman and Gaynor argue that more than human and multi-species approaches can enrich environmental histories by helping historians find new angles on familiar evidence and integrate previously understudied sources. In their view, more than human histories describe diverse worlds whose histories are co-constituted and contested, and they recognize the way in which their choices about how they tell those stories have ethical and political implications. So to raise Thoreau in this context might seem a little bit strange, since he's often taken as promoting a kind of individualist picture of the world, not the relational one described by more than human approaches. When William Cronin argued in 1995 that there was trouble with wilderness, the first paragraph ended by quoting Thoreau, who'd written, "In wildness is the preservation of the world." Cronin responded, "But is it?" He began doubtful about Thoreau's thesis, and the article elaborated why. Wilderness in America, Cronin wrote, was the inheritance of European religion, a value held by city folk who wanted to escape a romantic longing for the settler frontier and, quote, the last bastion of rugged individualism, which wasn't a good thing. Wilderness was a concept that hadn't preserved the worlds of North America's First Nations. In fact, it had facilitated their dispossession. Before America's national parks could be uninhabited, their inhabitants had to be, quote, rounded up and moved on to reservations. All this suggested that wilderness as a framing device for environmentalism and the dualism that it represented was a mistake. In the end, Cronin came back around to the words of Thoreau, "In wildness is the preservation of the world," and he made a distinction between wilderness, which is always out there, beyond civilization, in a problematic dualistic way, and Thoreau's wildness, which might be found anywhere, even in myself. Cronin ended by recommending learning to honor the wild, which he glossed as the autonomy of the other. But even if Cronin finally thought Thoreau could still be adopted into a wholesome picture of the world and humans' places in it, others have understandably not been so optimistic. So it's in this context that the first chapter of my book argues that Thoreau's retreat to Walden Woods, the experience that he relates in his most famous book, Walden, is different than most people's understanding would suggest. Where Cronin described Thoreau's piety as favoring a kind of stern loneliness, as he wrote, I try to show that interpreters have often projected their own desire for solitude onto Thoreau. I think something like O'Gorman and Gaynor's model of more than human history is possible for Walden Woods. Looking again at Walden with multi-species approaches can open our eyes to the social world that Thoreau occupied. So against a view that sees the Thoreau of Walden having departed from society in general, I demonstrate Thoreau keeping company with a community of spirit that is peopled by exemplary individuals, both dead and alive, flora and fauna. After affirming that Thoreau did participate and happily in human society, I also show that Thoreau aimed to recenter the woods as its own society. I describe Thoreau's relationships with animals, plants, and non-living objects, including a beautiful moment of interspecies language exchange among Thoreau, a chickadee, and a French woodchopper. Finally, I discuss Thoreau's attachments to what he called in Walden the former inhabitants of Walden Woods, a community of freed Black people who made their homes in the woods in the generation before Thoreau, and whose spirits were thought in Thoreau's time to still occupy the woods. Thoreau's interpreters have often neglected their history, but Thoreau did not. These people, among the first generation enslaved and freed in Concord, Massachusetts, had enacted freedom in the woods. They were one important example Thoreau had of what independence looked like and why it was important. In all this, the woods, as Thoreau described them, were a society. When we ignore the beings who made up his social world, we get a distorted view of the aim of what he called his experiment. Readmitting the members of Walden Woods to the story of social life there ought to transform our understanding of Thoreau's experiment and of his book, uncovering a more relational Thoreau. So my hope for the book is that it takes up the call issued by O'Gorman and Gaynor, among others, for us to re-examine old materials in light of multi-species approaches, and that the book can offer a reconfigured image of Thoreau for contemporary environmentalism. Political scientist William Chaloupkahas has argued that for the environmentalist movement that began around the first Earth Day, Thoreau left an apolitical legacy. Partly because of Thoreau, that movement endorsed an ethic, he argued, that collapsed into moralism and failed to address its own elitism. As scholars like Dorcetta Taylor in the United States have shown, much environmentalism has reinscribed race, gender, class, and other injustices. My account of Thoreau's religion aims to show that even if some of Thoreau's environmentalist heirs have been disinterested in social justice along lines of race, class, and gender, their mistake was not his. Thoreau's religion, as I describe it, was an integrated vision of nature, piety, and social justice, and it can serve as inspiration for the more equitable reconfiguration of environmental politics that is already underway. Thanks very much.